Welcome back to A Year of Final Fantasy, and we are still in the month of Odin, and today we're going to be talking about a very little known game. It's actually a mobile game, specifically called Final Fantasy Airborne Brigade. We haven't talked much about Final Fantasy mobile games so far, but here in this month we're going to start looking at a few of them. The mobile games are actually pretty good, all things considered, compared to just a general mobile game market. And I won't hide the fact, though, that I'm not a huge mobile game player, but Square has gotten my money for a few of their other hits that I do think are pretty worthy as being a true Final Fantasy experience. Anyway, let's look at Final Fantasy Airborne Brigade, and this is going to be a little bit of a quicker episode because, sadly, Airborne Brigade didn't have such a great outing, at least over here in the States. Full disclosure, I haven't played the game myself, so I can't give any personal feelings or feedback on this, but we're going to look at what the game brought to the table and see what was good about it and maybe what caused its downfall. So, Final Fantasy Airborne Brigade released in Japan on January 5th in 2012, and here in the States it was in December 14th of 2012. Also something to mention, it's kind of weird, but Korea got a version in August of 2012, and we don't really talk about Korea. It doesn't pop up much in the Final Fantasy lexicon, but I think it, was something interesting to mention here. Anyway, like I said earlier, it is a mobile game, and of course, as many mobile games are, this one was a free-to-play game. Many categorize it as a social game as well. Anyway, it was for the iOS and Android platforms, and it decidedly has a Final Fantasy theater rhythm look. And for good cause, it was made by DNA, which you may know as Nintendo's mobile game maker right now. And they were in conjunction with the people that did work on Theater Rhythm over at Square Enix, as well as a Kingdom Hearts mobile game that we'll discuss later on in the year. But you can definitely see where that Theater Rhythm influence comes from. So the game does have the classic Final Fantasy tropes that you would expect, such as the job system and the general Final Fantasy isms, I guess, if you want to call it that, like chocobos, summons, and of course the classic crystal story. This time we only have a story containing 2 crystals instead of the classic 4 that you might expect. One crystal has shattered and then the other one has lost its light, and of course enemies are invading the world because the crystal is no longer protected. And the whole point and premise of the game is to go off and show yourself to these espers, these summons, and in which case they have the power to make the crystal shine again to stave off the invading monsters. I mean, it's not, super intricate or whatever, but it's there, and simple story obviously, but mobile games, let's be real, aren't really known for their engrossing long-form RPG stories. Airborne Brigade does sport quite the list of jobs though, having the basic Freelancer and the Holy Sextet. They're also common to most Final Fantasy job systems. Otherwise, there are some advanced jobs, most of which you can see in games like, let's say, Final Fantasy V. There are a few notable ones here, though, that appear that we haven't seen before, such as the Sword Saint, and specifically the Assassin, which, you've seen Assassins in other games, but in Final Fantasy it's kind of weird to see. Along with those, we have the tried and true ones that we all know, like Dragoon, Dark Knight, Paladin, Blue Mage, etc., similar to the other job-based games. And this game, though, is kind of like a mobile pick-up-and-play Final Fantasy, and much like those, we have massive crossovers with other games in the series. In fact, all of the other major Final Fantasy games appear in one way or the other, and by that I mean you can summon major characters from the games to help you. It's pretty neat, but it's clearly a novelty, kind of like a cash grab. Hey, I can't fault them though. I mean, Final Fantasy is a huge franchise, and if you have that at your fingertips, why not do the crossover? So, after all is said and done, the game simply didn't really have the staying power for one reason or another, and the service was just shut down 2 years after release on December 1st in 2014. Less than 2 years, actually, after it appeared in America. It seems the game just didn't have enough content to provide the staying power that we need for mobile games. Mobile games are always having new stuff rolling out, and this one just didn't. The game also had, from what I've heard, very little to no sound at all, music included, which is a shame since Final Fantasy is known for its fantastic music by Uematsu. So it seemed like a feeble effort all around, but this was one of the first attempts at the marriage of the Final Fantasy and the free-to-play social mobile games. It wasn't necessarily the first mobile Final Fantasy game, but we'll get into that a little bit later. I'll end it on that note. I mean, I'm very curious if any of you got to play the game when it was operating and what it was like. I'd like you to leave your comments down below. I'd love to hear what you have to say about it. I want to see really how it was. But anyway, next time on A Year of Final Fantasy in the month of Odin, we're going to be talking about another mobile game known as Final Fantasy Dimension, and we'll take a good look at what brought this game to the table and how it differs from Airborne Brigade. So until next time, Crystal Warriors, keep on gaming.